Well, this is a technical question, but how do you weave that African history in the studies, in the curriculum? How do you...
Specifically, how do I weave it in? Okay, I can give you an example. Right now in my history class, we're studying various different less industrialized countries. For example, we're studying India in one class and Australia in another class. And my focus in studying those countries has been on colonization and genocide. So instead of just focusing on what's in the book material, I have to edit it as we go. And I want the students to understand the impact of what colonization has done to these people in these countries, and also how that has affected not only continental Africans, but also African people in the diaspora. And when I talk about the indigenous people in any countries, we always talk about genocide and the genocidal effects of colonization. So that's how I approach my material. Anytime I'm presenting anything in any of my classes, we always talk about the direct and the indirect impacts of whatever we're discussing on African people. I always tell my students, you have to analyze things critically. Whatever you're reading, you have to analyze. You have to look to see who wrote the book and who was the book written for, who was the audience, and why is this material being presented to you in this manner. You have to analyze everything critically, and that's really how I weave in an Afrocentric perspective in my classes. And it's beneficial to the students because the students come away with a feeling of a sense of self-worth, that they were somebody, that they are somebody, and that they will continue to be somebody. And it does make a difference in their interest in the classwork.
How would, Dr. Palmer, how would you describe the socioeconomic backgrounds of most of your children?
Okay, they come from all levels. We have people who are neurosurgeons with children there. As a matter of fact, before I boarded the plane, I had a visit with one of our parents who's a doctor. And then we have about 20% of the people who are welfare recipients, you see. So they go from the bottom to the top. I recall when we first started, about 20 years ago, that all of the students came from parents, so-called disadvantaged homes. They would come on bicycles and little Volkswagens, but now they come in Rolls Royces. We have about 5 Rolls Royces there. Sometimes they come in chauffeured limousines, you see. So we have a variety of...
have you noticed any difference between the children from low-income homes and those that come from Rolls Royce homes?
Okay, now...
She's saying,
Go ahead and let me tell you things.
Yes, I notice it, and I've discussed it frequently, because what I've noticed with a lot of the students who come from the more advantaged homes as far as economically, money-wise, they tend to have more behavioral problems, and they tend to, their attitude is a little different. I find that a lot of the students who come with not as much money available at home, it seems to me that some of their parents are more involved with what they're doing. That's not across the board, but I have noticed some of those differences, and I think the effect of it is just a societal effect of often when you have money, sometimes you're not at home as much with your children, and seeing to their schoolwork and seeing that they succeed in that sort of way. Money becomes to be a babysitter. You supply the kid with a lot of material objects, and so we even see that among our children also. With the money just impacts the children.
Dr. Palmer, you were about to say?
Yeah, what the sister hadn't told you is that she's a licensed attorney also. She is licensed to practice law in California, but she would prefer teaching at Garvey School, which is, I think, a tremendous testament to her concern and will. I recall when I was teaching that when I would teach Shakespeare, I was in the public schools. I never had a chance to teach at a school like Garvey. That when I would teach about Shakespeare, I would also have a lesson about Terence, and I would document conclusively that had there not been Terence, who was an African, that there would have been no Shakespeare. Because what our children are not told in the schools is that Shakespeare plagiarized his entire body of literature with most of his themes, with practically all of his poems, from Terence, who was an African. And not only did Shakespeare do it, but also Molière and that entire school of thought. And when they learned that it was an African named Terence, from whom Shakespeare plagiarized, then they became very willing and very eager to learn the various forms of English. And when I would teach them his story, at Garvey, we call it his story, and a couple of weeks ago, one of the students, he said, "Brother Onion," he said, "why do we call it his story?" I said, "Well, brother, because that's what it is." He said, "Well, if that's what it is," he said, "well, why don't we call it Hisley?" I said, "What do you mean Hisley?" "His lie." I said, "Oh, this is a 5th grade student." I said, "You know, I had never thought about that as long as I've been here, you know." So I think now we're going to start saying Hisley, you see. Okay, also, when I was teaching history, and when I would be teaching them about the European side of history, we would always come across Alexander the Great. He was a great warrior, a great politician, and a great robber and thief as well. But along with Alexander the Great, I would teach them about Cletus. And Cletus had another name. He was called Cletus the Black. Had there not been Cletus, there would have not been Alexander the Great. Because in Alexander's campaign at Persia, I won't go into all the details, but there was a Persian poised to bring his mace down on Alexander. And what happened is, Cletus saw this, and he ran up behind the Persian, and he hit him with such a hard blow, a sharp blow, that his arm, the sword, and everything came off, you see. And so he saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Persia. But you always see Alexander depicted as Alexander the Great, and you never hear anything about Cletus. So when the children would ask me, "Well, Brother Onion, why didn't they tell us about Cletus?" I would tell them, well, yes, they were going to tell you. They had every intention of telling you because they knew that it would have been morally correct to tell you. You would have felt better about yourself had you known the great things that your people have done in history. They said, "Well, why didn't they tell us?" I said, "Well, just as they were getting ready to tell you, the printing press broke down. So even in spite of their good intentions, they couldn't tell you." You see? So I say now, even though we don't have a printing press, we're going to make one in this classroom, you see. So when I was teaching, I taught everything from an Afrocentric perspective.
How does the African-centered perspective and curriculum differ from the Booker T. Washington, George Washington, Carver menu that even people as old as I am got in school? How does that differ? Well, conceptually?
See, we don't put George Washington, Carver, and Booker T. Washington down at all. We teach that George Washington Carver in particular was a great scientist. But see, this man was so obsessed with his creations that, well, that was his total obsession, his total life. And incidentally, he died broke too. As fast as he would bring these creations out, they would be absorbed, you see. And all this thing, you know, peanut butter, all that came from him. But he never received any of the benefits from it, you see. So we just teach them that there are many, many, many other heroes, and we have a constant venue of heroes, of black heroes and heroines that we parade before the brothers and sisters at Marcus Garvey School. And see, we tell them that had you been in the public school, the only two blacks you'd have heard about would have been Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. But we want you to know that you have heroes not by the ones, twos, threes, but by the thousands, you see.
Yeah.
And it is not in the interest of public education to have our young children walking around here with pride in themselves, or walking around here doing calculus in the 5th grade as you saw back there. How then are you going to convince them that their ancestors were nothing but slaves and that they should hate themselves? And if you hate yourself, you hate anyone who looks like you.
Okay.
Well, a big difference between the philosophies that George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington had in an Afrocentric approach is it didn't emphasize knowledge of yourself.
Yeah. No, I guess what I was asking was, even when I was coming up, we got a little bit of George Washington and Booker T. Washington. All right, but now we have the African-centered curriculum, where I guess African people are viewed as a central part of humanity, as opposed to a footnote. That's what I was. That's what I was trying to allude to.
Yeah, because their approaches emphasize a practical application of skills, but without the knowledge of who invented the skills and that it was our people that invented them. And I think it does make a difference And when you're applying your skills and the knowledge that you obtained, to know that it was you and your people that invented those skills, so that you're just basically replicating history.
When the child comes to your classroom, what message, verbal and nonverbal, do you want to send to that child?
Oh, I tell my children all the time. The main point that I want to send to my child is that just as we as African people have done in the past, we can do again. And that's what we're here to learn about. We're here to learn about our past achievements, our present achievements, so that we can continue achieving.
I saw in one article in the paper that you said one of the main things you want to find out is from your teacher is, do you love black children? Could you address that, please?
Yeah, well, actually, what I would really like to find out, true. First is, how do they feel about themselves? Because, see, if you don't love yourself first, well, then it's difficult for you to love someone who looks like you, and black children look like them. So the first thing that I look for is love of self, and if there's a love of self, then there's also a love of kind. Because unfortunately, there are a number of teachers of African American ancestry in the public schools working for Board of U.S Education, but some of them, unfortunately, now not all of them, but when I was an administrator in the public schools, I found that a few of these teachers held our children in as much contempt and hated them as badly as some of the other teachers did, you see. So we always look for how they feel about themselves, And one thing that I try and find out is if they have belonged to any community organizations, do they attend the various conferences and lectures around town, you see. But it's difficult now because they have so many traps for our young people now. It's difficult now to find people who are truly Afrocentric. But we have our own training program, and we try and bring them along as best as we can. And what I neglected to mention then, I did the same thing with the students in my class. Sometime a little later, they would ask me, well, Brother Onion, what happened to Cletus? That's the one who saved Alexander's life. And I said, well, yes. Now, wouldn't you imagine that he was rewarded by making him one of his trusted aides, or a governor of one of his provinces, or maybe the captain of his cavalry? And they said, well, yes. Which one did he get? I said, well, what happened to Cletus? He saved Alexander's life, right? Yeah, he did. So what happened to him? I said, well, Alexander murdered him. You see? And so they say, oh. So then I say, now, when you think about it, you're going to see that there's a lesson in this for you. You see, so you think about it too, and you'll see the lesson. It's obvious. And Cletus was unarmed when Alexander murdered him.
Let me get back to another question, and that is, how do you assess where your children are academically, where the students are?